What you witness in contemporary American politics is not merely a clash of policies or parties, but the surface manifestation of a profound spiritual war that has been raging for centuries. The degradation of political discourse, the apocalyptic language of opposing factions, the promise of ultimate salvation through political action, these are symptoms of a deeper disorder in the human soul that I have spent decades investigating. The crisis gripping America today cannot be understood through conventional political analysis. It requires what I call a philosophy of consciousness, an examination of the ordering experiences that either ground authentic political community or drive it toward the gnostic delusion of creating heaven on earth through human action alone. When transcendent order is forgotten, politics becomes a substitute religion, promising to deliver what only the divine can provide. This spiritual war is not between left and right, but between those who acknowledge the transcendent dimension of human existence and those who attempt to close reality to transcendence. It is between genuine participation in the divine order and the Gnostic rebellion that seeks to immanentize the eschaton, to bring about the end of history through political means. America's founding generation understood this distinction. Today's political actors have largely forgotten it, transforming politics into competing forms of secular salvation that inevitably produce violence, resentment, and civilizational decay. The urgency of recovering this understanding cannot be overstated. The spiritual disorder manifesting in American politics signals a crisis that extends far beyond any single election or policy debate. Chapter 1: The Gnostic Foundation of Modern Political Movements. Through my years of investigating the rise of totalitarian movements in Europe, I discovered that what appears to be secular political ideology is actually a form of pneumopathology, a spiritual disease that corrupts human consciousness. This same pathology now manifests across the American political spectrum, though its symptoms are often misidentified as mere partisanship or ideological disagreement. The Gnostic structure of consciousness operates through a fundamental rebellion against the human condition as it actually exists. Rather than accepting the tension between time and eternity that defines authentic human existence, Gnostic consciousness seeks to eliminate this tension through political action. The Gnostic believes that evil in the world results not from the inherent limitations of human nature, but from defective social arrangements that can be perfected through revolutionary transformation. Consider how contemporary American political movements on both extremes promise total transformation. Progressive movements speak of fundamental change, the creation of a new America, and the elimination of historical injustices through comprehensive social engineering. Conservative populist movements promise to take back the country, restore a golden age, and establish perfect security through political victory. Both operate under the Gnostic assumption that human beings can achieve ultimate fulfillment through political means. This Gnostic structure reveals itself in the apocalyptic language pervading American political discourse. Elections are framed as battles between absolute good and evil, where defeat means the end of civilization itself. Political opponents are not merely wrong but evil incarnate, deserving destruction rather than persuasion. This moral inflation transforms ordinary political disagreements into cosmic battles requiring total commitment and unlimited means. The promise of imminent salvation through politics attracts followers precisely because it offers escape from the anxiety of human existence. Rather than accepting the permanent tension between what is and what ought to be, Gnostic movements promise final resolution through the right policy, the right leader, or the right revolutionary transformation. This pseudo-religious character explains the religious fervor with which Americans now approach politics, treating political affiliation as ultimate identity rather than practical necessity. Chapter 2: The Eclipse of Constitutional Order Through Secular Salvation. The American constitutional order was designed by men who understood the dangers of concentrating ultimate authority in human institutions. The separation of powers, federalism, and the Bill of Rights all reflect an anthropology that acknowledges human fallibility and the need for transcendent standards that no political authority can claim to embody perfectly. This constitutional wisdom is being systematically eroded by movements that promise political salvation. When I examine the transformation of American institutions over the past century, I observe the progressive eclipse of constitutional restraints by administrative power justified through appeals to efficiency, expertise, and urgent necessity. The expansion of executive authority, the growth of regulatory agencies operating with quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial powers, and the weakening of congressional oversight all reflect the Gnostic impulse to concentrate power in enlightened administrators who claim superior knowledge about how society should be ordered. This administrative state operates on principles fundamentally opposed to constitutional government. Rather than acknowledging the limits of human knowledge and the need for checks and balances, it assumes that properly trained experts can determine the common good through scientific analysis and implement it through rational administration. This is Gnosticism in bureaucratic form, the belief that human beings can transcend their limitations through superior knowledge and technique. The judicial branch has similarly been transformed from an institution that applies law to one that creates policy based on evolving social consciousness. When courts discover new rights in constitutional texts that previous generations somehow missed, or when they redefine fundamental institutions like marriage based on contemporary sensibilities, they operate as Gnostic prophets revealing previously hidden truths about human nature and social organization. Even more troubling is how both progressive and conservative movements now view constitutional restraints as obstacles to be overcome rather than permanent features of legitimate government. Progressives speak of the Constitution as an outdated document written by slaveholders, while some conservatives advocate for constitutional conventions that would fundamentally alter our system of government. Both approaches reflect impatience with the messiness and limitations inherent in constitutional government, preferring the clean efficiency promised by movements that claim direct access to the people's will. This eclipse of constitutional order creates the conditions for what I call the metastatic faith, the transfer of ultimate loyalty from God to political movements that promise to solve the fundamental problems of human existence through properly organized social action. Chapter 3: The Transformation of Political Leadership into Secular Prophecy. Observe how American political leadership has been transformed from public service into a form of secular prophecy. Contemporary political figures do not merely propose policies, they promise transformation, healing, and salvation. They claim not just administrative competence but special insight into the meaning of history and America's destiny. This represents a fundamental corruption of political authority that my investigations into 20th century totalitarianism taught me to recognize. Have you noticed how political candidates now present themselves as possessing almost mystical understanding of American identity and purpose? They speak of fundamental transformation, of making America great again, of healing the soul of the nation. Such language transcends the proper bounds of political authority, appropriating religious and metaphysical categories that no human institution can legitimately claim. This prophetic inflation of political leadership creates what I call existential representation, leaders who claim to embody the true spirit of the people rather than simply administering their government. When political figures position themselves as vessels of historical destiny or instruments of divine will, they encourage followers to invest them with ultimate authority that belongs only to God. The result is political idolatry disguised as patriotic devotion. The rise of personality cults around political figures reflects this same Gnostic corruption. Followers do not simply support particular policies, they invest their ultimate identity and meaning in political leaders who promise to deliver them from the anxiety and uncertainty of human existence. Political rallies take on the character of religious revivals, complete with testimonies of transformation and promises of salvation through collective political action. This pseudo-religious character of contemporary political leadership explains the otherwise inexplicable loyalty that persists despite obvious moral and intellectual failures. When political figures are invested with prophetic authority, their personal failings become irrelevant to their essential function as instruments of historical destiny. Criticism of such leaders is experienced not as legitimate political opposition but as blasphemy against sacred purposes. The media participates in this corruption by treating political events as moments of revelation rather than ordinary governance. Elections become cosmic battles between light and darkness. Policy debates become theological disputes about the nature of justice. And political figures are evaluated not by their competence but by their fidelity to reveal truth about America's destiny. This prophetic inflation of politics creates impossible expectations that no human institution can fulfill, leading inevitably to disillusionment, rage, and the search for scapegoats to blame for the failure of political salvation to materialize. Chapter 4: The Destruction of Civil Society Through Political Totalization. One of the most destructive consequences of America's spiritual war is the progressive politicization of every aspect of human existence. When politics becomes a substitute religion, it cannot tolerate competing sources of meaning and authority. The Gnostic consciousness demands total commitment, transforming every human relationship and institution into an instrument of political struggle. Witness how family relationships, friendships, religious communities, educational institutions, and even recreational activities have become battlegrounds in America's culture war. This represents what I call the totalization of political consciousness, the expansion of political categories to encompass the entirety of human experience. When everything becomes political, nothing remains properly human. The family, which should serve as the foundation of social order through its participation in the natural and divine orders, becomes a site of political indoctrination. Parents are encouraged to view their children as either allies or obstacles in political struggle. Children are taught to evaluate their parents' worthiness based on political orthodoxy rather than natural bonds of love and respect. Marriage itself becomes a political statement rather than a sacred participation in the creative order. Educational institutions, which should transmit the wisdom of past generations while fostering intellectual inquiry, become factories for producing political activists. Rather than learning to think clearly about permanent human problems, students are taught to identify themselves as members of oppressed or oppressor groups engaged in cosmic struggle. The university, once devoted to contemplative pursuit of truth, becomes an instrument for manufacturing revolutionary consciousness. Religious communities face pressure to subordinate their transcendent loyalties to political imperatives. Churches are evaluated not by their fidelity to reveal truth but by their utility in advancing political agendas. When religious leaders speak primarily about political issues rather than eternal questions, they transform sacred institutions into mere appendages of secular movements. Even friendship, which Aristotle recognized as one of the highest forms of human relationship, becomes impossible when political identity supersedes personal virtue and affection. Americans increasingly report losing friendships over political disagreements, indicating how thoroughly political categories have corrupted natural human bonds. This totalization creates what I observe as islands of disorder, institutions that should provide refuge from political struggle but instead become additional theaters of conflict. When no aspect of life remains immune from political contamination, human beings lose access to the contemplative experiences necessary for psychological and spiritual health. The result is a society of alienated individuals who know themselves primarily through political categories rather than participation in natural and transcendent orders that provide genuine meaning and stability. Chapter 5: The Recovery of Transcendent Order Through Personal Resistance. Despite the apparent triumph of Gnostic consciousness in American political life, the possibility of recovery remains because the fundamental structure of human existence cannot be permanently destroyed. Human beings are constituted by their openness to transcendent reality, and this openness reasserts itself even under conditions of severe spiritual disorder. The question is whether individuals will recognize and respond to these moments of recovery. Have you experienced moments when the frantic urgency of political struggle suddenly appears hollow and insignificant compared to the enduring realities of love, beauty, truth, and divine presence? These experiences of transcendence provide the foundation for what I call existential resistance to the disorder of modernity. They remind us that human fulfillment comes not through political victory but through participation in the eternal order that grounds all authentic community. Personal resistance begins with the recognition that no political movement, however noble its stated aims, can provide ultimate meaning or salvation. This requires what I call pneumatic differentiation, the ability to distinguish between temporal and eternal dimensions of existence without collapsing one into the other. Political action remains necessary and important, but it cannot become a substitute for the primary relationship with divine reality that constitutes authentic human existence. The practice of contemplation provides the most effective form of resistance to political totalization. When individuals regularly engage in prayer, meditation, philosophical reflection, or aesthetic contemplation, they maintain contact with sources of meaning that transcend political categories. These experiences of transcendence serve as existential anchors that prevent complete absorption into gnostic movements. Intellectual resistance requires the cultivation of what I call noetic insight, direct apprehension of truth that cannot be manipulated by ideological construction. This involves serious engagement with the great works of philosophy, literature, and theology that preserve authentic human experiences across historical periods. When Americans read Plato, Augustine, Aquinas, Shakespeare, or Dostoevsky with genuine openness, they encounter modes of consciousness that reveal the poverty of contemporary political discourse. The recovery of genuine community provides another form of resistance to political totalization. When individuals form relationships based on shared pursuit of truth, beauty, or goodness rather than political affiliation, they create what I call islands of order within the broader cultural disorder. These communities may be families devoted to transcendent values, religious congregations focused on eternal rather than temporal concerns, or intellectual circles committed to honest inquiry rather than ideological conformity. Perhaps most importantly, resistance requires the courage to remain open to experiences of transcendence even when such openness appears naive or irrelevant to contemporary political struggle. The person who maintains faith in divine providence, hope in ultimate justice, and love for truth itself provides a living witness to the bankruptcy of political salvation. Chapter 6: The Classical Sources of American Constitutional Wisdom. The spiritual crisis manifesting in American politics reflects a broader amnesia regarding the philosophical and theological sources that originally grounded American constitutional order. The founding generation drew upon classical and Christian wisdom traditions that provided substantive content for concepts like natural law, human dignity, and limited government. Recovery of these sources offers the possibility of institutional and cultural renewal. When I examine the writings of figures like Madison, Hamilton, and Jefferson, I discover minds formed by serious engagement with classical political philosophy, Christian theology, and modern natural law theory. They understood that legitimate government must acknowledge transcendent standards of justice that no human authority can create or destroy. The Declaration of Independence explicitly grounds human rights in divine creation rather than social construction, while the Constitution establishes institutional mechanisms designed to prevent the concentration of ultimate authority in any human institution. This classical foundation assumed what I call participatory consciousness, awareness that human beings participate in a cosmic order that they do not create but can either respect or violate through their choices. Natural law theory provided the intellectual framework for understanding this participation, while Christian theology offered the experiential foundation through its emphasis on divine transcendence and human dependence. The decline of classical education has severed most Americans from direct contact with these sources. Contemporary political discourse operates with impoverished anthropological assumptions derived from modern ideologies rather than sustained reflection on human nature and destiny. When Americans speak of rights, they typically mean subjective preferences rather than objective participation in transcendent order. When they speak of democracy, they mean popular will rather than ordered liberty under divine law. Recovery requires what I call anamnetic restoration, the conscious recollection of forgotten experiences that once grounded authentic political order. This involves serious engagement with texts like Aristotle's Politics, Cicero's Laws, Augustine's City of God, and Aquinas's political writings. These works preserve insights into the relationship between individual virtue and social order that remain permanently relevant to political life. The natural law tradition offers particularly valuable resources for contemporary Americans because it provides rational grounds for transcendent standards of justice without requiring specific religious commitments. When individuals understand that human reason can apprehend objective moral truths through reflection on human nature and its requirements, they gain intellectual tools for resisting both relativistic subjectivism and ideological dogmatism. Classical political philosophy also provides models of statesmanship that transcend contemporary categories of left and right. Figures like Pericles, Cicero, and the American founders understood political leadership as a form of practical wisdom devoted to the common good rather than partisan advantage or personal aggrandizement. Chapter 7: The Possibility of Spiritual and Political Renewal. The crisis of American politics, severe as it appears, does not represent the final triumph of Gnostic consciousness over transcendent order. Throughout history, periods of spiritual disorder have been followed by recovery when individuals and communities rediscover their proper relationship to divine reality. The question is not whether such recovery is possible, but whether contemporary Americans possess the intellectual honesty and spiritual courage necessary to undertake it. Genuine renewal cannot be achieved through political means alone, because the crisis originates in disordered consciousness rather than defective institutions. Political reform becomes meaningful only when grounded in prior spiritual and intellectual recovery. This requires what I call metanoia, a fundamental transformation of consciousness that reorients human existence toward transcendent reality rather than immanent substitutes. The process of renewal begins with individuals who recognize the bankruptcy of political salvation and commit themselves to the disciplined pursuit of truth through contemplation, study, and prayer. These individuals become what I call existential representatives of authentic order within a disordered society. Their commitment to transcendent values provides a living witness to the possibility of human existence grounded in something more substantial than political ideology. Educational institutions capable of transmitting classical wisdom play a crucial role in this renewal. When schools and universities recover their proper function as communities devoted to the pursuit of truth rather than political indoctrination, they provide the intellectual formation necessary for citizens capable of self-government under divine law. This requires courage from educators willing to resist the totalitarian impulses of contemporary academic culture. Religious communities that maintain fidelity to transcendent revelation rather than subordinating themselves to political movements offer another source of renewal. When churches, synagogues, and other religious institutions focus on eternal questions rather than temporal political concerns, they provide the spiritual formation necessary for citizens who understand the proper limits of political authority. The renewal of family life represents perhaps the most fundamental requirement for broader cultural recovery. When families transmit genuine wisdom traditions rather than political ideologies, when they cultivate virtue rather than mere success, and when they ground their relationships in transcendent love rather than utilitarian calculation, they provide the foundation for all other forms of authentic community. Political renewal becomes possible when sufficient numbers of citizens possess the spiritual and intellectual formation necessary to distinguish between legitimate government and gnostic movements promising salvation through political means. Such citizens can support necessary reforms while maintaining proper perspective on the limits of political action. The ultimate ground for hope lies in the indestructible character of human openness to transcendent reality. No matter how severe the spiritual disorder, human beings cannot permanently close themselves to experiences of divine presence, truth, beauty, and goodness that constitute their essential nature. Conclusion. The hidden spiritual war behind American politics will be resolved not through electoral victories or policy reforms, but through the recovery of authentic human consciousness oriented toward transcendent reality. The Gnostic rebellion against the human condition inevitably fails because it attempts to deny the fundamental structure of human existence as participation in divine order. Your role in this recovery does not require heroic political action or revolutionary transformation of society. It requires the much more demanding task of ordering your own soul through disciplined openness to truth, beauty, and goodness in their transcendent dimensions. When you commit yourself to contemplative practices, serious intellectual inquiry, and genuine relationships grounded in virtue rather than utility, you contribute to the renewal of authentic order within the broader cultural disorder. The classical and Christian wisdom traditions that once grounded American constitutional order remain available to those willing to undertake the intellectual and spiritual discipline necessary to appropriate them. These traditions offer not escapist nostalgia but living resources for understanding and responding to the permanent problems of human existence that manifest themselves in every historical period. The spiritual war raging in American politics represents a crisis that extends far beyond any particular nation or historical moment. It concerns the fundamental question of whether human beings will acknowledge their dependence upon transcendent reality or attempt to create meaning and order through their own efforts alone. The stakes could not be higher, but neither could the resources available for those committed to authentic recovery. The truth about human order cannot be permanently destroyed, only temporarily obscured. Your task is to live consciously in the tension between temporal disorder and eternal order, maintaining hope grounded not in political possibilities but in the inexhaustible reality of divine presence in human existence.